Today, we are making potato bread. This recipe is coming to you from the Elder Scrolls official cookbook. This is a very simple recipe, so while you're putting everything into the bowl to prepare the dough, you can be preheating your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. The recipe calls for 2 cups of pre-mashed potatoes. We eyeballed it, so we ended up using a little less. If you did the same thing that I did, which is pre-make the mashed potatoes and then leave them in the refrigerator overnight, I would recommend that you heat them up in the microwave for about 30 seconds because they're going to be much easier to work with that way. 1 to 2 cups of flour. We're using all-purpose flour today, but there are substitutes listed again in the book. We're going to need unsalted butter. We only had salted butter, 3 tablespoons of that, 1 egg, which is to be incorporated into the bread, and a mix of spices. Now, the book calls for the imperial spice mix, but we didn't actually have all the ingredients for that, so we used what we could and made our own. There is marjoram, cumin, parsley, thyme, and oregano, as well as a little bit of lemon pepper salt and some orange zest. Everything goes into the bowl all at once, then slowly add the flour as well as the egg and the spices and the butter all together until it becomes a rough dough. It shouldn't be too sticky and it shouldn't be too moist. Once we have a dough that we are able to work with, we're gonna cut it into pieces just based on how much you have. We had enough to make 6, so that's what we made. We're going to form them into little rounds. And then we're going to place them on our baking tray, which has been floured. The recipe calls for using cornmeal to keep the dough from sticking to the tray, but we didn't have cornmeal, so we're substituting flour, and it worked just fine. Last step is to poke the tops of the breads with a fork just to keep them from rising too much, I suppose, and then stick it in the oven for 15 to 20 minutes. Chicken dumplings. These dumplings are a specialty of many an inn across Skyrim where travelers can enjoy them hot after a long day's journey, but they are also a popular pick in one's own homestead kitchen. In either case, the creamy filling has restorative properties, especially washed down with a flagon of the local specialty. So this recipe isn't necessarily complicated, but it is a bit longer in terms of how much prep needs to be done. We are going to be working with 2 cups of cooked chicken. So you can either cook that from raw to begin with, or you can get a roasted chicken, but the recipe does call for around 6 drumsticks worth. That is what it is quantifying as 2 cups of cooked chicken. So our chicken was already pre-cooked. We cooked it the night before. So the next step is to create the rest of the filling. The recipe calls for leeks. We're going to be using an onion today, as well as a medium-sized carrot and some garlic. onions are going to go in first. If you're doing the recipe from the book, it is going to call for a leek instead. We're using onions. So the onions are going to turn translucent. They're going to get a little tender. We're not browning them though. And then goes in the garlic and the diced carrot. After all the vegetables cook, we're going to be adding some storm cloak seasoning, a tablespoon of all-purpose flour, and we're going to stir that in order to make sure that the flour is fully incorporated, as the cooks like to say. Then comes 3/4 of a cup of cream. Now I added mine a little too quickly, so I think my mixture ended up a little less liquidy than it was intended to. Mine turned out a little dry. Salt and pepper to taste. After all of that is fully incorporated, what we're going to do is take it off of the heat and add 1/4 of a cup of grated cheddar cheese and let that melt in, mix that up, and then we're going to add the meat. Now, my pieces of meat here, we didn't really break them down enough. I think they were a little too big. It led to some problems later down the road. So just make sure that you were either tearing up or cutting the chicken into more bite-sized pieces than I have here, but then we're going to mix everything together and let that stand. Next, we need to go ahead and grab our pie dough. You can be using pie dough that you just purchased at the grocery store, or you can make pie dough yourself. That is what we did. We used the rye pie dough recipe, but that will be in a separate video. Now, what we want to do is we want to take the pie dough, roll it out to 1/8 of an inch thickness, and then cut it into squares, and those are going to be our dumplings. Ye old medieval Tupperware. This is a technique that has been passed down through the generations for creating perfect squares in pie dough. Perfect. The Tupperware trick worked great for actually cutting out the squares, but when I do this again, I will be just using a knife because the rounded corners actually made it very difficult to seal the dumplings up properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that filling and portion it out into each one of these squares. The recipe says to leave about 1/2 of an inch on each edge of the square in order to leave enough room for the dumpling to close. We had that about, but we still ended up with some tearing, and I think that's because the rounded corners of the square weren't quite reaching all the way to the center like they needed to. Before we fold the dumpling, we're going to wet each one of those edges with a little bit of water. And then we're going to take one corner from each end, fold those into the center, mush them together so they seal, and then take the corners from the other 2 ends and fold those together as well. And this will form 4 seams that we can then seal together. And you could do a nice crimp or something like that if you wanted to. We just sealed them like that. Final step is to baste them with a little bit of egg wash, and then we're going to put them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for around 30 minutes. Festival hand pies. This coming to you from the official Elder Scrolls cookbook. So briefly, what we have prepared here is a tablespoon roughly of butter. That is just to cook the meat in. We are using 1 to 2 cloves of garlic, just depending on how big your cloves are, minced so that they can incorporate with the meat. 1/2 tablespoon of storm cloak seasoning, 3/4 of a pound of ground beef, 1/2 cup of sour cream, 1/2 cup of grated cheddar cheese, a full cup of cooked white rice, salt and pepper to taste, and of course, pie dough. And finally finishing off with enough heavy cream just to baste over the top of the pies when they're ready to go into the oven. Now, As I'm going through this recipe, I'm actually going to be adding my own little quality of life improvements because I think there are steps that will make this easier that aren't detailed in the book. The first step is to take that butter and melt it down over medium to medium high heat in a pan. Then we're going to add the garlic, let that cook until it gets to a nice golden color. And then we add the meat, the 3/4 pounds of ground beef. Now this is where our recipe for the video is taking a slight deviation because I actually didn't have 3/4 pound of ground beef, so I substituted the rest of the weight with some ground pork instead. So that is something I encourage everyone to do with every recipe. You think that an adventurer, you think that a medieval person back in the day would look at a recipe and go, I don't have all the ingredients for it, so I guess I just can't make it. No, they improvise, they adapt, they overcome. After all of the meat has been cooked along with the garlic, everything is browned up nicely. The meat should probably be cooked fully all the way through. We're going to turn that heat down to a medium-low, and then we're going to add the sour cream and we're going to add the rice, stirring to make sure all of that gets incorporated fully. And you'll see in the footage here that I'm doing my best to break up those little clumps of meat, break up the little clumps of rice, because I want this to be as pasty of a consistency as possible. I didn't quite succeed, but I think that is what we should be shooting for. That's going to fit into the pies as filling the best. After the sour cream and the rice have been fully incorporated in the pan, we're going to take that off the heat and then add the cheese in, letting that slowly melt as we are stirring it around. Now we can prepare our pie dough. Now here is the second deviation of the video. The book simply calls for the rye pie dough recipe, which is also in the official Elder Scrolls cookbook. But neither the recipe for the actual festival hand pies or the recipe for the rye pie dough actually tell you how much pie dough is yielded, how much you need for this recipe. I'm using store-bought pre-made pie dough for this video simply for convenience sake. I'm assuming many people are going to like to do that, but if you want to go all the way, I'm sure it'll taste really, really good. You're going to take that pie dough, roll it out, and then cut it, in this case using the old medieval Tupperware method, to create roughly 4 to 5 inch diameter circles. We want an even number of circles because we're actually going to be layering them. We're not folding them like dumplings, we're actually creating tiny little pies. But we ran into the problem that I think one box of pie dough, which essentially comes with 2 shells, one for the bottom and one for the top of the pie, is not enough for the amount of filling that the recipe itself creates. So my recommendation is, if you're using store-bought pie dough, buy 2 of those boxes. Each box should have 2 rolls in it, so you have a total of 4. That should yield enough. And for the record, 1 box of that pie dough, which was 2 shells, probably around 10 inches in diameter each, that yielded a total of 12 little circles, which means we are getting 6 pies. This brings us to my third recommendation that is not detailed in the book, and that is if you want to be able to add more filling and really get these pies to have as much in them as you can, cut all of the circles at 2 different sizes. So the bottom piece is at, say, 4 or 5 inches, and then the top piece is at maybe 6 or 7 inches. That way you have that extra bit of room. After all the circles are cut out, we can go ahead and put the filling in the center, making sure to leave a little bit of room around each of the pie circles. Now again, this is the fourth difference. The recipe tells us that we should be putting these circles and filling them in the pan that we're going to be baking in. I think it's going to be a lot easier if you don't do that and do them on a flat surface instead. You can see in the footage here that I'm struggling against the rim of the pan because it's not giving me enough room to actually do the next step, which is to crimp the edges of the pies using a fork. I originally started using this little wooden fork because I thought it would look very aesthetic on camera, but I ended up switching out for a metal fork because I was afraid that I was going to break the tines on this little wooden fork with the amount of pressure that I needed to really get these to seal up. Which brings us, I think, to the fifth difference, my recommendation to you to make your life easier that isn't detailed in the recipe, which is to go around the outside of at least one of the edges before you crimp it with just a little bit of water. That's gonna help it seal a lot better in my opinion. The first one I didn't do that, and it just didn't take even with the crimping. And then as soon as I started adding water around the edges, it was a piece of cake, pun intended. So I'm not really sure why that isn't in the recipe. It just makes everything a lot easier. Go over your edges with a little bit of water before you do your crimping. Now the penultimate step is to go ahead and baste each of those with that heavy cream. And it just gives it this really decadent look, and it's gonna come out nice and crispy. And I really didn't use a lot of heavy cream for this either. A little bit went a long way. The final step is to preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Celsius is also always listed, and we're going to let those bake for approximately 25 minutes. Now ours took a little bit longer than that. You're just gonna wanna keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't burn. If they look undercooked, they're undercooked. Once we take them out of the oven, we're gonna let them sit, cool down for just a couple minutes, and then it's time to serve them. Biscuits. And this is a great way to reuse old pie dough if you happen to have that sitting around, or you can make pie dough from scratch. But that is essentially the main ingredient here. This recipe is coming to you from A Feast of Ice and Fire, the official Game of Thrones cookbook. All the ingredients and the book itself will be linked down in the description. You're gonna need 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 5 tablespoons of butter, and just a little bit of cold water. You're gonna add the flour and the butter in together. It'll be easier if the butter is already cut into smaller pieces. You don't wanna melt the butter with the heat of your hands, so work it gingerly with your fingertips, or maybe even use a pastry cutter. And what you're looking for is a nice crumbly consistency. Then you add just enough water, a little bit at a time, until it forms into a dough, and then you don't wanna overwork it. And that is essentially how you make a pie dough. The next step is to roll that out into a 1/4 of an inch thick sheets. Now that's pretty thick compared to what you'd actually want to use for pie, but these are gonna end up being biscuits. So 1/4 of an inch, and then we're going to just cut them into little circles. I'm using the top of a glass here. It's very simple, and we're gonna separate those out. Now we're going to take those little rounds and we're going to fry them over the stove in a frying pan with butter. And these are frying. So we need to use a little bit more butter than we think, because what I found is that when you don't use enough butter and then that butter sort of burns away and all that's left are the little rounds in the pan, they burn super, super fast. So you're frying them, use more butter than you think that you need. It'll take about 3 minutes on each side. We're gonna take them out and pat them dry. While that is happening, we're going to take 1/4 of a cup of honey and boil it in a small saucepan, again, over the stove. Being very careful not to burn the honey, but we wanna get it nice and broken down. It'll be very liquidy when we're done. Once all that's done, we just need to glaze all of the rounds with that honey and then sprinkle them with a little bit of cinnamon, and we are done. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Cooking Anachronism. I will see you very, very soon. And if you do decide to try these out, I very much hope you enjoy. In the meantime, I would like to wish you good luck on your adventures.